As usual for the WFA, we're delighted to welcome many of you from multiple time zones today, so I'm going to hesitate from saying good morning, but I suppose we say good afternoon and evening as well. Seeing colleagues from Australia, Hong Kong, New Zealand, and here in Europe as well, and a really nice mix of both our corporate members as well as our national associations. Before we get into it, as always, I'd like to just preempt a couple of questions. Firstly, yes, we will be able to share the presentation with you after this session, and we'll also make a recording of this webinar available for you to share with your colleagues. We should have you with us for just under an hour today, and today we're going to be focusing on a topic which has almost always been top of the WFA's agenda, which is transparency. Firstly, I'd like to put some faces to names. I think most of you will know me, Rob on the right. My colleague Natalia and I will be making sure this webinar runs as smoothly as possible today, and we'll be taking your questions. But our guest speaker, our star if you like, for today is Nick Manning. Many of you know Nick. He's not a stranger to the WFA, and he's now the Chief Strategy Officer for Ebiquity, and he's been a good partner and a friend of the WFA for many years. For those of you who are new to the WFA, in summary, we're a global network for client-side marketers, and within our membership we have over 80 of the world's biggest multinational brand owners, but also, critically to today, we have 60 national advertiser associations. So to name a few, ISBA in the UK, UPA in Italy, ANZA in New Zealand, AANA in Australia, etc., ISA in India, but critically for today's session, representing the world's biggest ad market, we also have the ANA in the US. Many of you will know that WFA has been around for a while. We were founded in 1953, and it's this screenshot I've taken from the WFA history section on our site. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a history lesson. As this slide will show you, actually, media transparency was one of the WFA's founding tenets in 1953. So I'm afraid we've not fixed it yet, but we're still working on it. No, seriously though, joking aside, the face of the transparency discussion has, of course, changed greatly, and our media forum, you see here, meeting in Europe at Lego's offices, focus on this very regularly when we meet in Europe or US or China or India. And we also have a smaller task force within that network called the Global Transparency Group. And their three core areas of focus are ad fraud, which currently tops our bill, and we recently ran a webinar on that, which is available to view if you're interested, as well as viewability and transparency in relation to remuneration, which of course is the focus of today's session. And before we get into this, I'd just like to sort of emphasize, if you like, the need for a balanced perspective here. There's been a lot of press flying around and a lot of anger, to be frank, and I think I just wanted to quote our president and CMO of RBS, David Weldon, who you see in the picture here. You can see a URL at the top there. There's an article that he recently wrote with his position on it, but just really, in summary, warning that there's more at stake here than may meet the eye. Maintaining and restoring trust between clients and our agency partners isn't a nice to have, it's critical. As I said, you can check out the article via the URL at the top of this slide, but the key point here is that there's actually going to be bigger battles to fight, like ad fraud, and battles in which we're going to need our agencies on our side. So, yet transparency concerns amongst WFA members remains as high as ever. In our 2016 priority survey, 85% of all WFA members, and I'm not just talking about our media director members, said this was high or a top priority. So it's still top of our agenda and something that we need to continue to address. Many of you will know that with the help of Bernard Glock, formerly global media lead at Procter & Gamble, we've been focused on media rebates and other areas since before we first published our media charter in 2000. And since 2010, we've been looking at the relative levels of rebates by market, but also critically whether those rebates have been disclosed and returned to the clients as investment generated them. More recently, we've worked with Ebiquity and telemetry, as you see here, to create our global transparency index. And the slide you see here is a snapshot of that project, which ran across the biggest 20 ad markets based on ad spend, and covered EMEA, APAC, and the Americas. We'll be running this again in 2016. But whilst it's beyond the scope of this webinar to go into too much detail, I just really want to underline one point. The world is obviously a complex place, where some marketers see media rebates as completely unacceptable. Others have essentially been brokers' markets for a very long time. And as you can see from our overview, markets differ greatly, and a one-size-fits-all approach typically does not make sense. As I said, it's beyond the scope of this document to go into too much detail on our work, but you can find the document that I just mentioned and other related work on our global knowledge base. Just follow the link at the top of this slide and let us know if you don't have your login details. But the focus of today isn't global. Today we're going to be focusing, as I said, on the world's biggest ad market, the USA. As I mentioned, the ANA is one of our 60 National Advertisers Association members in the world, and back in 2014 they worked with Forrester and got a good picture of the concerns of their members relating to media transparency. And in 2015, the discussion heated up hugely in the US with a presentation from John Mandel, a former CEO of a US media agency. And this obviously kicked off a huge storm in the USA and led to the proactive creation by the ANA of their Transparency Task Force, who ran a pitch process and appointed K2 and Ebiquity to really get to the bottom of this. Many of you will have read the findings of this investigation, and today we're going to hear this and some follow-up recommendations, very much from the horse's mouth, so to speak. As I said, Nick Manning is CSO of Ebiquity. But before I hand over to Nick, I want to hand over to you. And staying with the American theme, I'm going to ask you to take part in a quick poll. Don't worry, it's not about the US election. As a Brit, I'm just quite pleased not to be talking about Brexit for once. So here's the first poll of the day. If you could register your opinion. So how confident are you that you're currently achieving your required level of media transparency? So are you very confident, not very confident, not at all confident? So thank you, Natalia, for posting that up. And while we just wait for a few more people to reply, I'd just like to remind you, please, as we go through this session, you should be seeing a Q&A widget on the right-hand side of your screen. Please, at any point during the session, feel free to post your questions, and we will allow plenty of time at the end to put those questions to Nick. So if we can just close that there, Natalia. So, okay, so very interesting, quite honest group, I think. Only 23% saying that they're confident, but the large share, so 57% saying they're not very confident, and as I said, a very humble and honest 20% saying they're not at all confident, which I think is probably pretty representative of most of our members. So thank you for taking part in that. So if you could just take that off. Okay, great. Now, audio allowing, I'm going to hand over to Nick. Welcome back to the debate.
Yes. As Rob said, we're going to take you through a number of things here, really, and it's really the full results of the study that's been taking place in the US late last year and early this year into the US media market and the extent to which it is a transparent or untransparent marketplace, which has been the subject of quite a lot of debate over a number of years, actually. So I'm going to show you the results of the study that was conducted by K2 Intelligence to understand the workings of the marketplace. I'm going to take you through the recommendations that we, as Ebiquity and Firm Decisions, have now provided to the ANA for how advertisers should respond to the market. And I'm going to talk about the global context for this as we go through as well, because although this is specifically a US exercise, it has global implications and application to the rest of the world. So let's talk first of all about the US study, and this took place between late last year and early this year, and the purpose of it was to resolve a great deal of market uncertainty. The ANA, as an organisation representing the advertisers, the national advertisers of the US, wanted to understand why there were so many different messages in the marketplace. effectively conflicting accounts regarding the extent to which media trading incentives existed in the marketplace. Rob mentioned the Global Transparency Index, and historically, the US was deemed to be a relatively transparent marketplace with a relatively low level of media trading incentives. But there were different voices saying different things, so they wanted to understand what was really going on, to identify the existence and the extent of any rebates in the marketplace, and then, depending on the outcome of that study, to provide guidance for their members as to how they should improve media transparency. And all of this, in a way, is designed to try and restore trust between advertisers and their media agency partners. David Weldon is absolutely right that the relationship between advertisers and agencies is critical, and it needs to be based on a very strong bond of trust. And that trust has been eroded in recent years by the presence of media trading incentives, or certainly the presumed presence of trading incentives, and particularly in digital, where the market is very complex, and generally speaking, a lot of advertisers don't fully understand exactly how that model works. So just a quick thing on timelines. Rob, this is very, very brief, but Rob mentioned the fact that last year at a financial management conference in the US, there was a statement by an ex-director of one of the agency groups who said that everybody in the US was living under an illusion if they believed that rebates and other incentives didn't exist in the marketplace. Immediately, the big agency groups came out and said, we don't agree, we don't think there are rebates, we don't take rebates, they don't really exist. So there were absolutely different voices in the marketplace. So the ANA decided they wanted to find out what was going on. They issued an RFP to a number of consultants in June of last year. And after a very long process, they appointed K2 Intelligence and ourselves, Ebiquity and Firm Decisions, to conduct the work. And the K2 Intelligence part of that really was to carry out field work, which is to understand what is going on in the marketplace by interviewing market participants from agencies, media vendors, consultants, ad tech companies. And that field work took place between October of last year and May of this year. The results of that study were published in June, as many of you will have seen. And then last week, Tuesday of last week, our own study, our own report on the recommendations as to how advertisers should respond to the K2 study were published. And I will be taking you through all of this as we go through this morning's content. And in the end, what the ANA really wanted to know is how transparent is this marketplace? And actually, it isn't just about rebates. It's about whether there is full disclosure of the relevant information that advertisers need to make informed and intelligent decision making, of which rebates may be a part. And that's a pretty critical distinction, as we'll say as we go through. Now, so in the end, the K2 intelligence study, which took place between May and October and May, revealed numerous transparent practices. Many of you will have seen either the report itself or the reporting of the report. And the sample they had, which was a very, very strong sample, showed that media trading incentives are indeed, to use the word of the report, pervasive in the US marketplace. In other words, it is not just happening at the margin. This is something that is happening in a pretty widespread way across the US market. And it isn't just amongst a small cluster of agencies. It was across a very wide range of agency media entities, spanning many different types of agency group, and not just in certain media, but across media channels. So it was not restricted to a small number of agencies or small number of channels. It was pretty widespread. To quote the report, there were elements of systemic behavior. In other words, this is something that's happening not by chance or in a limited kind of way. It is pretty much a part of the market. And there's plenty of evidence that it was mandated at quite a high level within the agency groups. In other words, there was senior management involvement in this. And there was widespread evidence of straight cash rebates, and we'll go through some of the aspects of this in a second. Free inventory, which is an increasing feature of the marketplace, where inventory is being made available at no charge or low charge. And what are known as service agreements, which to all intents and purposes are rebates under a different name, whereby a service is delivered to the media vendors by the media agency groups, which may or may not be a real service. And we'll describe all of these in detail in just a moment. And the other thing that the sample revealed is that most advertisers either were not receiving any rebates back or actually unaware whether they were or not. So quite a lot of market confusion there, but certainly plenty of evidence from the K2 intelligence report that there is a significant level of media trading incentives in the US market. But perhaps the principal finding from the entire exercise was that advertisers really didn't understand exactly where they stood anymore. They feel there is a strong conflict of interest now between what they're trying to achieve maybe and what some of their trading partners are trying to achieve. And historically, there was always a tendency to believe that media agencies always acted in the best interests of the client, first and foremost. And I think that the study reveals that can no longer be taken for granted. It certainly used to be maybe, but maybe it isn't anymore. And what is happening, of course, is that media agencies are having to balance very carefully, really, a duty to their own clients versus their duty to their own shareholders, particularly given that the groups are largely publicly quoted entities with shareholder responsibilities. So there is a degree of, if you like, conflict or tension within the industry for that reason. And the other thing that became very clear from the study is that the relationship between the clients and the agencies is now defined by the extent of the contract. In other words, the contract goes so far, but stops at a certain point, and to a certain extent, therefore, anything beyond the contract is considered to be legitimate. And therefore, if you like, the duty of care that the agency has is limited by the contractual terms. It also became increasingly clear from the study that there is quite a lot of confusion over what is known as principal trading, which is where media agencies are effectively buying media inventory on their own account, sometimes at risk, and then effectively selling that media to their clients on an internal market basis. And many clients don't really understand exactly where they stand in relation to that particular dynamic, whether the agency is acting as a genuine agent with strong fiduciary duties towards the client, or whether they're now a principal and therefore selling media to clients. It's also clear, and I think we've known about this for some time, that there are some internal incentives within the media agency world which can drive behaviour in terms of favouring certain options over others, and that came through from the report, and we'll discuss that in a minute in more detail. And ultimately, the bottom line is that clients are not as clear now as they used to be on potential conflicts of interest in their relationship with their trading partners. So let's talk about some of the detail of this. I'll take you through some diagrams of how some of this works. This is the most simple, basic diagram of how the rebate market works. The agency of record, which is the American term for the lead media agency, takes the accumulated spend of its client base. In this instance, we've just taken $350 as the total. They trade that $350 with the media suppliers on an aggregated basis, and at the end of the year, there is a 10% rebate. And there was evidence from the K2 sample of straight rebate deals of this nature. And many of you will be familiar with this model. It's existed in other parts of the world for a long time, but there was evidence of this kind of model operating in its most simple fashion. But actually, there was plenty of evidence also of a much less simple model. This is the service agreement model. It's exactly the same as the one you've just seen, except for the addition of what is known as service agreements, which mean that the rebate, instead of going directly back to the agency of record, the $35 that we talked about just now is rebated to an affiliate entity of the agency of record or its agency holding company. And there have been examples of where that affiliate may be a US-based entity or in some instances an offshore entity. So the money is being rerouted in a different way, and to a certain extent, therefore, is more difficult for any of the individual advertisers on the left-hand side of the screen to be able to identify where that money is going and whether it's being delivered or not. Theoretically, there is a service that is delivered between the agency of record and the media vendor, the supplier, to justify that, but in many instances that is either a service which is not rendered at all, or if it is, it's rendered in a very sort of light fashion. And therefore, to a certain extent, I think it's pretty clear that those kind of agreements are really kind of rebates in another form, particularly as in many instances thrown up by K2, they were volume related, which you wouldn't normally expect to be the case for a basic service. Principal trading was another key factor here, particularly in digital. This is where the media supplier is trading with a principal entity, in many instances the agency trading desk, and this is where the price agreement between the media supplier and the agency principal entity is not disclosed to the advertiser, so there's no sight of that. Then if that price is represented as $Y, then that is effectively passed through from the agency principal entity, which is a trading desk, plus a markup of some kind, which again the client will tend not to see, and then eventually that flows through to the advertiser from the media agency, including the agency trading desk markup, and in many instances there is no agency of record fee attached to that. So to all intents and purposes, the advertiser believes they're not paying a fee on that. But what they don't see is the rate exchange between the media supplier and the agency trading desk, and they don't see the amount of markup that's happening between the agency trading desk and the agency of record. So quite a sort of untransparent system. And there are other variants of that. So here we have another example. This is one of the more complex ones, which is a trade between a single media supplier, which involves two elements of it. One is known as an undisclosed or non-disclosed arrangement, and one is disclosed, otherwise known as opt-in agreements. So effectively, for the same media inventory from the main media supplier, two deals are done at the same time. So in the first deal, a rate of, and these are all representative numbers, the numbers have been obscured to make them anonymous, a rate of, let's say, $50 for a CPM maybe is agreed between the media supplier under deal A and the agency trading desk, but that rate then flows back through the agency of record at $95. So there's an immediate markup of quite significant amount, as you can see there, between $95 and $50. And that rate of $95 is passed back through to the advertiser, again with no fee. But under a disclosed model, which isn't opted in, the same deal for the same inventory is actually done at $100, in other words, double the undisclosed rate, flows through to the agency of record, flows through to the client at the same rate, but this time with an agency fee. So to the advertisers who are under deal A, as far as they're concerned, they're getting a better deal because they're paying $95, not $100, and no agency fee. So in the model worked through in K2, the advertisers who are in deal A are about 8% better off than they would have been than if they were going under deal B. But in reality, the margin for deal A is more like 90% for the agency group and far less, obviously, for deal B. So this is basically how the opt-in model works and how much more margin can be made basically from the undisclosed opt-in model. And they are, to all intents and purposes, with the same media supplier for the same media inventory. There's no real difference. And then we go a little bit further and we talk about, okay, programmatic trading, how does that work? Well, the media supplier agrees a rate with the supply side platform to represent it. That rate then is passed through to the demand side platform, the DSP, but including this time a supply side platform markup. The demand side platform passes the rate through to the agency trading desk, but obviously puts its own markup on, so that by this stage you have the supply side markup and the demand side platform markup. The agency trading desk will pass that through to the agency of record with its own markup. And by the time the advertiser pays, the rate is the same, except that by this stage there have been 3 levels of markup applied to it. And of course, the advertiser doesn't know what the original X was that was traded between the media supplier and the supply side platform. So very untransparent, and if you thought that was complicated, the next one, which also came from the K2 sample, is where the rate is passed through other agency-controlled tech entities, but so by the time the advertiser pays, there's been an extra level of markups between the two tech entities involved in all this. Now, I realize this is quite complicated. I refer you to the K2 intelligence study for more detail. It's worth plowing through the whole thing in detail. But I think all of this is evidence that there is plenty of untransparency in the marketplace, which clients are, broadly speaking, unaware of. And in many instances, the agency of record themselves are not also aware of the way that the market really is working below the surface of the water. So let's talk about what this might all mean for advertisers if we look at the K2 findings. There are a number of potential implications of all of this, and in the end, they all could jeopardize media effectiveness. It could be that these deals compromise media strategy and planning, because if media planning is done according to is at all influenced by the rebates available in the marketplace and other incentives, that can damage planning. If you're trying to justify using certain media vendors and not others, you may choose to ignore certain research and data findings. If you're trying to sell something to a client because there's a rebate behind it, it might be at a higher unit price, so media costs could actually rise. We see examples from the K2 study and elsewhere that value may be transferred between different clients. In other words, cost advantages may be exchanged between clients to achieve higher agency income. We see internal incentives in the K2 study, which can influence recommendations potentially. In other words, agency groups are incentivized to use trading desks, for example. And in the end, the use of technology and data, which is a very complex issue in programmatic in particular, can obscure the decision-making ability of clients in what is a very complex marketplace. And at the end of it, if you're trying to measure effectiveness, improve effectiveness, then that can be compromised too. So these are the potential side effects of an incentive-led market. Why is it happening? Well, there are a number of reasons why. Pressure on holding company margins. We are all understand that there is that pressure there, and it's not that anybody is under any illusions about this. There is a huge amount of profit pressure on the holding companies, all of them, and it applies across the board. So it's not as though anybody is under any doubt about that. But obviously, that's not, if you like, an issue for the clients. They do understand it, but of course, what they want to know is what's happening with their money and their value. Suppliers are all under pressure to guarantee revenue, sometimes to prop up a declining business model, sometimes to guarantee future revenues. We've seen a lot of consolidation and globalization in the media agency industry, so to a certain extent, a lack of, if you like, real choice for clients in the market, plus enormous negotiation clout now, of course. Client pricing pressure, to a certain extent, has played a role in all of this in terms of the agencies feeling that they have to reduce their headline prices, and we're not saying this is the right outcome, but they do tend to then go and find other revenues elsewhere. The digital marketplace in particular has made it a much less transparent market, and plenty of evidence from the K2 intelligence study and elsewhere of limitation on contract terms and audit rights. So that's, I hope you can still hear us okay. I think, Rob, we're going to a poll now.
Yeah, that was clear. Thanks, Nick. So, Natalia, if you could just launch the second poll. So, another question for all of you. How well do you understand the business model of your media agencies and how they make their revenues? Obviously, this is all anonymous. Be interesting to get your views. While you just register your vote, just a reminder to please feel free to post your questions. We've already had a few coming through in the Q&A widget, which you should be seeing on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and we'll allow time for those afterwards. So thanks for your polls. Natalia, if you could perhaps close that one there. So again, a very humble and honest group today, and 63% saying not very well. And I'd hasten to add here, I think if we asked this same question a few years back, probably the answers would have been very different. It's a case of what you don't know, or you don't know what you don't know. So And so very interesting. Nick, back to you.
Now we're going to talk about the second part of this, really, which is how we move forward from that. And this really goes into the recommendations that we gave to the ANA's members in terms of how they deal with the lack of transparency in the marketplace. And this is the report that was published this week. So first of all, we think this is very much about establishing trust. It is very, very important that our clients have that they have a very strong relationship with their agencies. So it's important that trust does exist. And so there are three core pillars, I guess, really to the recommendations. One is about what advertisers should expect from their media agencies. One is about what advertisers need to ensure best practice in media transparency. And finally, how do you ensure a strong partnership that is actually moving towards a common purpose? So there are agency management principles in the recommendations. There is a way that we say that there should be the re-establishment of the primacy of the advertiser's interests, and then a code of conduct. And all of that it comes through 7 strategic platforms that we've identified as a way of guaranteeing greater media transparency. We start with agent versus principal. In some ways, this is quite a surprising place to start for some people, because it would appear to be not the primary issue, but actually, because it came through from the K2 intelligence study as being such an important area, it is a very core area that we believe advertisers need to understand and control. So in principle, there's no real reason why an agency shouldn't, if you like, act as a broker in certain circumstances, as long as the advertiser controls those circumstances. So where the advertiser agrees to the agency acting as a principal, and it's very clear that they are, the advertiser needs to have disciplined and very reliable processes to make sure that there are no conflicts of interest in that environment, and that the advertiser gets the benefit of the agency's accumulated negotiation abilities without the downsides. So key questions that need to be answered, and which we have got protocols for in the document. Do I have an agent or principal relationship in any given situation, on any given plan even? Do I understand the potential loss of my right through opt-in agreements or undisclosed agreements? Am I getting advantages which outweigh any potential loss of rights? Do I have the right ongoing processes in place to protect my interests? And there are a whole set of recommendations in the document which deal with that and how advertisers protect their interests in that environment. And it basically means take control, understand exactly what's going on, and make sure that the agencies declare where they have a principal's position and not an agent position. We thought with the WFA, this is such a big area that it warranted a little mini poll in its own right, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's an area that may be newer to some than others, but the question we wanted to ask was, do you know exactly when now that Nick's explained it, for those of you who weren't so aware, do you know exactly when your media agency is acting as agent and when as principal? So very straightforward, yes, no, or don't know. And I think I wouldn't be ashamed to say if you're not sure, because you wouldn't be alone in that. So okay, Natalia, if you could just shut that down. So that's quite interesting. So nearly half of you, 46%, say no, you don't know when your media agency is acting as agent or when as principal. And as Nick said, well, principal at law, actually not necessarily a problem as long as you're actually comfortable with that, and you've basically been made aware and have agreement and understanding. So, Nick, any thoughts? But I think it's quite interesting result.
Yeah, what I would say is, to a certain extent, that maps the K2 intelligence findings. Really, many advertisers that were spoken to as part of that study also did not really understand the differences between agent and principal, and didn't necessarily know when their agencies were acting in either of those two capacities with them. So the poll there, I think, is reflective of what we found from K2. So strategic platform number 2 was all about the contract, and in many ways it is all about the contract. Advertisers have to ensure their contracts with their agencies contain very robust provisions to deliver full transparency. Key questions are: when was the contract last updated? They're out of date very quickly now because of changes in the marketplace. What does the contract cover? But most specifically now, in many ways, is what doesn't it cover? Because many contracts are deficient and have shortcomings. Is it clear and ambiguous, and unambiguous rather? And there are many examples of that. And who's signing it? Who's responsible for agreeing this deal at both on the client end and at the agency end? Is it even signed? And we've seen many examples of unsigned contracts. And an important part of what's been produced for this is a new template contract for US advertisers, which was developed over the last only months or so between Reed Smith, who are the A&A's attorneys, working with ourselves and the A&A, obviously, to produce a new template contract for US advertisers. And that was helped enormously by what had happened in the UK prior to that, where Isbar and Field Fisher in the UK, working with ourselves and other consultants, produced a new UK template. So there are some good practices in the marketplace now coming through. And no contract is complete without good audit rights. Advertisers have to have good contracts, but they also have to have robust and far-reaching audit rights, which allow them to fully track contract compliance and measure media value delivery very precisely. And the choice of contract compliance and audit partner has to be and must be the choice of the client and not be dictated to them by other people. And the scope of the audit has to be clearly agreed by the client as well. We've seen many instances recently of where the agency groups have tried to influence the choice of auditor and the audit scope. And it's very important, therefore, that in any MSA or client contract, that those are spelled out very, very clearly. And those audit rights have to extend to all parties taking part in the advertiser's interest. So the agency of record, the holding company, trading desk, and affiliates, barter agencies, everybody involved has to be subject to the same audit rights. And that's pretty critical to make sure you have that. And even more critical than anything else in some ways is there should be unrestricted access to data and all records that are needed to make sure you have the ability to carry out effective audits. Number 4 was all about contract governance. Advertisers should implement strong internal processes to make sure that contracts are delivered, which deliver accountability, compliance, process governance, and significant senior management oversight, because we found many instances really where clients simply don't have internal governance protocols to do this. In many client companies where we're talking about investments running into hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, we believe that should be the subject of oversight by the audit committees and risk management committees within client companies. The contract, given that it's a very sizable contract, should be signed by the chief financial officer of the advertiser, and should also be countersigned by the CFO of the agency or its parent company to make sure that there is the right top-to-top agreement on what the contract says and delivers. And any amendments should be agreed by the same parties, especially when it comes to things like opt-outs. We believe also that many client companies should appoint a chief media officer because there are so many aspects to this, which are both legal, commercial, technical, data, that there are so many aspects to media now that somebody needs to control them all. And obviously there are some clients who already have somebody who fulfills that function, but many who don't. And sometimes there's a bit of a gap between procurement and marketing in terms of who has responsibility for some of these functions. Obviously, the chief media officer would be supported and work with finance, procurement, legal, and other functions within the client company to produce all of this. But it's very, very important that all of this has proper legal underpinning as well to make sure that the contract is delivered in full across all of the various aspects of it. And there should be an annual review by advertisers of all of their contractual arrangements, and certainly self-compliance by the media agency partners should also be conducted annually, but reviewed independently annually as well. Number 5 refers to data and technology. Advertisers should take ownership of all of the data that is used as a result of their trading activities and exert control over the technologies used on their behalf. We see many instances, and it was very clear from the K2 study, of where clients simply don't have control over the technology and data that's being used on their behalf, particularly in programmatic. And it's very important that they do have control over that. So within the strategic platform number 5, there are a number of protocols that we've developed for how media planning data should be independently arrived at, how clients should choose the right partners and suppliers in terms of their trading, particularly in digital, where there are so many partners and suppliers involved, how clients maintain involvement and control over their data, how they measure results, in particularly in programmatic, and also which programmatic platforms they should be using and how they should be using them. Clearly, I am abbreviating a lot here. We're not going through all of the detail that is within the document itself. We're simply trying to make sure that you're aware of the core platforms, and then obviously you can dive into the report as much as you wish. And obviously, if any individual wants to talk about this in detail with us, then clearly we can do that. Number 6 is all about what the advertisers should take on in terms of responsibilities themselves. And we believe that the stewardship of media is very much something that advertisers should lead, and obviously work in conjunction with their media partners to make sure there is a joint responsibility for this. And part of that is to make sure that the scope of work that is agreed is delivered, but is also fairly remunerated. So clearly, it's important that advertisers take responsibility and lean into this process, but also that they reward their partners fairly for what they do, particularly if we want to eliminate transparency and if we want to make sure that agencies are fairly rewarded and are also going to be fully transparent. And that entails having a very clear scope of work, but also a clear remuneration process that sits behind that scope of work. This is something that the ANA felt quite strongly about, and I think is fair, is that advertisers should not demand unfair payment terms. I mean, I think it's fair to say there's been some quite a lot of trade press about some advertisers asking for very long payment terms, sometimes 180 days, etc. We think that's something that we need to be very careful of, because it does encourage agencies to take quite a cynical view sometimes of how they're viewed by clients. Number 7 is actually something that we were very, very keen to maintain, which is a code of conduct. The bond of trust between clients and agencies is a very important one, but gets lost after the contract is signed. So what we have advocated is there should be a code of conduct that sits alongside the contract itself, which ensures that everybody knows exactly what they should be doing on a day-to-day basis and builds up that culture of trust between them. So sitting alongside the Master Services Agreement is a day-to-day document that everybody involved understands, which spells out the advertiser responsibilities and what the advertiser commits to doing to help that relationship, and also what the AOR, the major agencies' responsibilities are as well. And while that sounds like quite a simple idea, it's part of the problem that doesn't exist, is that once the contract's been signed, people either forget about it or ignore it, or tend to sort of say, well, we'll look at that in a couple of years' time. That it's very important that a code of conduct sits alongside the contract to regulate day-to-day operations. So those were the 7 platforms. We wanted to leave plenty of time towards the end of the webinar for people to ask questions. We've seen some of the thread of things which people have been talking about throughout. I think it's quite important actually to restate something right at the start, which is about the K2 intelligence study, which is that it was absolutely designed to be anonymized and non-attributed in terms of any individuals, any advertising groups. You will see no reference whatsoever in any of this to any groups as such. If one thing was absolutely fundamental to all of this, it is to say this was a market study which was not about naming names or embarrassing or shaming anybody. It was to actually understand general market behavior. And what came out of the K2 study was that there were very, very strong patterns of behavior which were pretty widespread across the industry. So, there's no sense in any of this really that any one group or another is being talked about in any way separately or individually, and that was very much the ANA's intention right at the start. So, Rob, I think it's time to go into questions.
Absolutely, no, thanks for that. I mean, I think the interesting observation from my side and listening to you is that the kind of arguably the race for efficiency has been at the cost of effectiveness, and a big part of that comes down to the sort of internal capabilities within the brand owners. So, you know, having a deeper understanding internally, and we have the same discussion when we talk specifically just to programmatic work we've done, or whether it's ad fraud. Understand that, you know, often it's hard to justify those FTEs, but it's a key area, and that chief media officer is a really interesting recommendation that came out from that. But anyway, to the questions. One thing I just want to sorry, Natalia, maybe just mute Nick for a second. One thing I just want to, in terms of sort of fair payment terms, we can respond to those questions separately, but in terms of what fair remuneration looks like as a WFA, we're not really in a position to do that, because due to competition law, you'd potentially be accused of setting market prices, but that doesn't mean that we can't help you in relation to remuneration. So we'll respond to those ones individually. One question coming up around whether it's better to have the contract that you have in place signed to sort of holding company level, and the question related to that is, and then what do you do when they refuse you access in terms of from a media auditing perspective? Question for you, Nick.
Well, it comes down to having the right contract in the end, which is that if the contract says that you have unlimited access to all of the things that you need to have to do that, if they've signed that contract, there's no real reason why they should stand in your way. Now, we all live in the real world, and we live in this world all the time, where we spend a lot of our lives having to work very hard to get access to data sometimes. But as long as the contract is right, and as long as the terms make it very clear what access is determined by the contract, then that should prevail over anything else. It's easier said than done, but that's why the contract is so important. And one of the things that the K2 intelligence study showed is that in many instances, contracts were either old, unsigned, had big gaps in them, or were otherwise not extensive enough in terms of covering the whole trading chain. And that is absolutely the case as we observe it on a day-to-day basis. And therefore, the new MSA that has been produced by Reed Smith and the new media agency template contract from ISBA are so important, because they represent today's best practice in what should be in a absolutely archetypal client agency contract. And in both of those documents, they have very wide reach in terms of going to agency holding company, into the affiliates and associates and related parties of the holding company, and they spell out very, very clearly what the audit rights are and also what the data access rights are. And it's up to each individual advertiser then to determine the extent to which they are prepared to push that through. We think that most clients need quite a lot of assistance in doing that from a legal perspective. So we think it's important that they have the right resources available, sometimes internal resources, sometimes external resources, because it is difficult to negotiate these things. Let's not be naive about that. They are difficult things to negotiate, but they should be negotiated. And I think what's good about the K2 intelligence study, and I hope our part of this, is that these issues are now wide out in the open. There are no longer any kind of no-go areas, and if nothing else, there is now a high degree of awareness, understanding, and acknowledgement of these issues. So, from a point of view of media transparency being now tabled as a global issue, I think we've travelled quite a long way.
Absolutely. One question coming back to the principal versus agent. Someone asking if that comes down ultimately to local country regulations.
Necessarily know that it does. I mean, we all know that there are different ways of working in different markets. So the UK is an entirely principal market in contractual terms. But what we're really talking about here is where agencies are, and this can apply in any marketplace, are buying media inventory on their own account and then passing it through to clients in a way that is not transparent. And that can apply anywhere, irrespective of whatever the local legislation environment is. And it is, of course, it's a phenomenon which is growing a lot throughout the world, particularly in the digital space. And if we go back to those complicated diagrams we talked about, the K2 intelligence studies show very clearly that the margins can be anywhere between 30 and 90% in those instances. Those are big margins by anybody's standards. If you compare those to the standard margins that can be gained elsewhere, then if you're getting those kind of margins successfully, the temptation is to do more of it. And I think the real danger, therefore, is that that model becomes entrenched and then goes into more markets around the world, and then clients start to lose control more and more. So we spent a lot of time looking at the whole agent versus principal thing, and in the MSA, the draft MSA, and in the recommendations document, there is a lot about the agent versus principal issue and how advertisers should deal with it, because we see that as being a significant priority.
Great. And one question which I'm hesitating to ask, it's not, of course we have our own view on this, but it would be interesting to get the Ebiquity perspective. The question was Loi Sapin in France. Those of you who aren't aware, France used to be much more of a broker's market, and that law was put in place, which arguably had an impact on moving France further left on a transparency index. And the question was whether a Loi Sapin solution, as in France, could help solve the problem. What's your view on that, Nick?
Possibly the most difficult question I've been asked all year, actually. I think it's very difficult to answer that, because that's a very specific set of circumstances. But actually, if I recall correctly, although it's slightly before my time, but not much, that was brought in because of the fact that the French market was a broking market. And actually, Loi Sapin was introduced because the authorities were concerned that broking was distorting the media market to the detriment of advertisers, and ultimately, therefore, to the detriment of consumers. And you could say, and it could be said, although this wouldn't apply everywhere, is there is a danger that the way the marketplace is going in terms of becoming more principally driven, that the same conditions are starting to apply. So we're not saying necessarily that all principal trading is wrong necessarily. We just think that advertisers need to have very, very strong ways of understanding where it's happening on their behalf, but also a great deal of protection to make sure that they get the right plans in the first instance, and that the agencies are very clear on where they're dealing on a principal basis, and where they're not, and therefore declaring any conflict of interest. I think if that happens, Rob, then there's no need for the intervention of any further authorities, but that's beyond our reach.
Absolutely. It's a tricky question to ask, but okay, there's quite a few questions that have come through. I'm conscious that we've gone a little bit over time, obviously, as we had some sort of tech difficulties earlier, but if we haven't come to your question, I apologise, but we will do individually, and we'll pass those on to Nick. I think one of the things that just wanted to sort of have almost a final word from our president, David Weldon, about the importance of not disregarding agencies. Some people asking questions about direct deals, and of course that we have seen an increase in those amongst our members. But as he said in that article I mentioned earlier, we need to keep agencies at the forefront of our thinking, and the collaboration is really going to be vital. And that's not just hearsay, that's obviously going to be critical from our perspective. So something that we need to look to regain trust further. And I have to say, I think the work by ANA and Ebiquity and Firm Decisions on this has been fantastic, and I think the whole code of conduct area particularly really nice innovation. And the question came up as to whether we might work on something that could be applicable globally, I think from Chris in Belgium, and I think the answer is probably yes. We'll talk to the ANA and we'll talk with Ebiquity. But these topics are areas that we're going to be focusing on in our meetings. I've highlighted the ones in red relating to this topic that we've focused on today. So absolutely, we'll be seeing sort of the application of the great work that's been done by the ANA and Ebiquity in the US, and how that can be applied elsewhere. And finally, for those of you who haven't seen the actual K2 findings, I strongly recommend that you read them. And also, if you haven't seen these recommendations, yes, we will be sharing this PowerPoint with you, but let us know if you didn't actually see the ANA report as well. So just remains for us to say yes, thank you so much to Nick for coming back and joining us today. And thank you for all of you for joining. Obviously, this is the start of a journey for many, and we look forward to collaborating with you, both our corporate and national association members, in fighting the good fight and regaining trust in the industry. So thanks again, and we look forward to speaking with you and seeing you very soon. Thanks, Nick.
Bye-bye.